Just a few housekeeping announcements for those who are joining us in person. The restrooms are around the corner, so if you head to the right and out, follow the restroom signs. And we have parking validation for everyone, so if you are a City of Austin employee who works in the PDC, you will already be able to swipe your badge and get out, no problem. But if you are joining us from another city department and do not office at the PDC, you'll have a validation on your way out with the ticket that you got when you came in. For folks joining us from the public, same thing, except your validator will say non-COA. So thank you for joining us. Okay, we are going to get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest installment of the Imagine Austin Speaker Series and the first of 2024. I'm Ann DeSanctis with the City of Austin Planning Department, and today we are going to be asking and hopefully answering, what could sustainable and equitable zoning look like in Austin? The speaker series is based on a format of shared dialogue and mutual learning, and it's aimed at promoting and implementing the policies of the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan, the City of Austin's 30-year plan for the future. We accomplish this by inviting thought leaders both locally and nationally to give several talks a year on land use, transportation, mobility, housing, public health, social equity, and environmental sustainability, all to promote and implement Imagine Austin policies. Our featured speaker today is Sara Bronin, a seventh-generation Texan, architect, attorney, and professor of planning and law at Cornell University, whose interdisciplinary research and practice spans historic preservation, property, land use, and climate change. Additionally, Sara founded and directs the National Zoning Atlas, a collaborative project to digitize, demystify, and democratize U.S. zoning codes. Really excited to hear more about that. After receiving her architecture degree from the University of Texas, Sara earned a master's at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship and a law degree from Yale. So these are pretty heady credentials. So steering us on this dive into zoning is the Planning Department's resident, self-proclaimed non-expert, our Public Information Officer, Caleb Pritchard. Caleb is a former journalist who covered local government for the Austin Monitor. After 5 years of consistently annoying council members with his coverage and Twitter jokes, communications director, a position he held in that office and in a subsequent office for another half-decade. He joined the planning department in February and will be pleased if you don't pelt him with rotten vegetables, virtual or otherwise, today. Thanks for joining us, and I'm going to hand the mic over to Caleb, literally, so give me a second to move it around.
Well, thank you, Ann, for that very pleasant and well-written intro. I wrote it. Yes, in fact, I'm indeed Caleb Pritchard, and on behalf of the Planning Department in the City of Austin, we welcome everyone to the Permitting and Developing Center here in the Happy Highland neighborhood of Austin, Texas. Also a hearty hello to everyone out there in internet land who is watching. It is true, as Ann said, I'm no expert in urban planning. Everything I know about zoning I learned in SimCity on Super Nintendo. And when I started covering city council meetings and planning commission meetings, I was very disappointed to learn that it's not as simple as 3 zoning categories and that's all you got. It truly is a deeply complex concept that generally lives in the world of wonks. However, its significant impact on our daily lives obviously cannot be overstated. It dictates what our cities look like and how we get around and how we grow, and it determines, to a large part, who can live where in our cities. So our speaker today, Sara Bronin, is the true expert in the field, and I'll be doing my level best to keep up with her and make sure this conversation is as accessible and understandable to everyone in our audience today. So in just a few minutes, I'll let her get rolling, but first I want to remind everybody that there will be a Q&A session when she's done. So if you're here in the audience, let some ideas percolate, and we'll have somebody, Evelyn will be running around a microphone to get you on the record later. And if you're watching online, you can certainly put your questions in the chat, and we'll have a team of wonderful, beautiful people who will be compiling those questions and sending them my way. As Ann said, please no rotten vegetables, but I personally, in my grocery budget, will appreciate any fresh fruits that you can throw my way. So without further ado, here is the fabulous Sara Bronin.
So much, Caleb, and thank you, Ann, and thanks to the city for inviting me. As my presentation gets queued up, just wanted to say how excited I am to be back here in Austin. This morning I was at the YimbyTown conference with 500 activists and advocates from around the country, hoping to answer exactly this question in their own communities: sustainable, equitable growth, and how we do that with an abundance of housing. So, taking the energy from that room and the excitement that many of those first-time Austin visitors had, I'm bringing that here today. So I'm going to try to advance and just say, for me, this is a bit of a homecoming because I lived here for 5 years, 1996 to 2001, under the first tenure of Mayor Watson. And he actually opened YimbyTown this morning and talked about his first term and how Austin had changed. I wanted to just talk a little bit about my experience here as a student before moving on. And I have to say that when you're a student in any place, but including Austin, your radius starts out pretty small. I went to architecture school and was here for 5 years, though, so I had a little bit more time than most. And as I was thinking about this presentation and thinking about, okay, what did I know about Austin then? How do I know it now? I wanted to kind of just reflect back and say the many, many students, the fountain of youth, as they were called this morning, who come into this town, have a pretty small radius at first. So they start on the UT campus. Many live on campus. They might eventually move to the west or north campuses, and all of the planning issues that those have experienced over the years, planning issues and conflicts present certainly in the late 1990s. Many of them, of course, visit downtown. Back then, people still went to 6th Street. I don't know if they still do anymore, given its somewhat interesting reputation. Clarksville, my sister lived in, she still has a condo in Clarksville, although she's just moved to Pittsburgh. But Clarksville and the beautiful historic bungalows, that's a beautiful neighborhood, as is Hyde Park, another neighborhood that I spent some time in. And then when the professors of the architecture school would invite us over to their fancy houses overlooking Barton Creek and Town Lake, maybe a little bit of Barton Hills. When I was also a student, there was a few controversies on the UT campus itself. I was on the Faculty Building Advisory Committee for 4 years, which basically means I was a student representative on the way that the University of Texas grew. My vote was not at all consequential, to be honest, but I learned a lot about the pressures of campus growth and how the university was trying to manage the construction of its buildings, and also manage, even at that time, a projected increase in student population. So working on that, having the honor of being on that committee 4 out of the 5 years that I was a student, again, really centered me in what was happening at the University of Texas. One of the issues at the time was this issue of the famous Swiss architects who were going to build the Blanton Museum, and that, if any of you out there remember this issue, it was a very avant-garde design that not everybody liked, and they were yanked from the project, and then a different architect came in and built the project, the Blanton Museum as we see it now, more in the style of the University of Texas campus. But it raised the issues of what is compatible, what is architecturally appropriate for a place where there's innovation and learning. It resulted in the dean of the school, the architecture resigning, and some other fallout. But nonetheless, their building was not realized, and we have a different design. Also, as a student, I co-chaired the campus campaign for light rail, and that was a tragic vote that I'm actually talking. I was talking with Mayor Watson this morning, and how different the city would have been if we had voted for it then, if it had not failed by the few hundred votes that it failed by. If we had thought in 2000 that we would centered growth around nodes of transit. And I know that's changing now, and I know there's going to be more build out in the future, but it was a truly missed opportunity to not have done it 23 years ago. And then finally, just to say, over that time, again, even in those 5 years when I was a student, the city was growing phenomenally. It grew during that period by 23% in population just during that 5-year period. So as I was experiencing, looking for housing off campus, looking for housing, I lived on 5th Street in just west of downtown, and just, experiencing that, and then coming back and, every year coming back and looking at how the city has evolved today, it's clear that the issues are not resolved, and I don't think they will be resolved today. You're very optimistic to think so, but just to say, the issues that the city is dealing with had roots in the 1990s, had roots going far before that too. Oh, here's a little rail supporters mobilize. I couldn't find any images of my friend David dressing up like a rail car on the West Mall. That was the best I could do. I know most of the people in this room are familiar with zoning, but for anybody online who's interested in learning a little bit more, or just getting the basics, zoning is both text and map. So it is both words that describe how different districts can be built, and it is a map which tells you where those districts are located. This map and text, this is a chart actually, it's a form-based code, are from the city of Hartford, Connecticut. I chaired the city's zoning commission there for 7 years, and during that time we rewrote the zoning code, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. We wrote the 10-year comprehensive plan for the city, and we also did the city's first climate action plan. We also rewrote the city's subdivision regulations and adopted inland wetlands and watercourses regulations, which we thought we had done at some point, but nobody could find a copy of. So we just cleaned everything up. My background as a law professor compelled me to really think about all the words on the page collectively, all of the different levers of development that Hartford used or was required to use by the state, or had the option to use, and thinking about how all of those work together. So again, zoning, text and map. Zoning regulates uses, structures, and lots. So in any district, you might have regulations on the way land is used, you might have regulations on the way a building is built, or an accessory structure, or you may have rules on the way that the lot can be developed, including setbacks, build to lines in the case of Hartford and other places with form-based codes and so on. I'll talk maybe a little bit about the National Zoning Atlas later, but this is a glimpse into a page of the atlas, just listing out the different kinds of districts that we see in communities. And I didn't note which town this was in, but I do know, it's Binghamton, New York. So there are these districts in the city. They're residential, non-residential. There's 3 primarily residential districts. Those represent the bulk of the land, even in a city like Binghamton. And then the zoning atlas classifies zoning districts and matches them with geospatial layers. Austin, of course, has a zoning code. I think that's what we're talking about today. It's about 400 pages, and just to put that in context, it's longer than El Paso and Nashville, but not as long as Boston. Boston has a 3,791-page zoning code. I haven't been able to find a longer zoning code. If there's anybody in the audience out there that has an example, please let me know. And no, New York City's code is not longer than that. So I wrote a report for the city of Boston. You can find it online. It's called Reforming the Boston Zoning Code, and it talks about just the sheer length and complexity of a code can be a proxy the length of the code can be a proxy for its complexity. So Austin actually is not looking too bad on the 402 pages front. And I think it has maybe 63 sort of listed districts, and I think probably a little bit more as you get into some of the other overlays and sub-districts. But cities that ask themselves about their zoning, do we think it's working, do we think it's not working, they have some choices. And I think they're basically two choices. So one is a complete overhaul, and one is a piecemeal approach. I did write a paper about comprehensive rezonings, and that's what a complete overhaul is, just to throw out the old code and bring in a new code. They have not been done in very many places. In the period that I studied in that article, there were only about 24 cities that had completely rezoned. None of them were Texas cities, so you certainly don't see Austin on that list. You don't see San Antonio or Dallas. And Houston doesn't have zoning where I'm from. No. Although the Supreme Court just said that the historic districts were zoning, but that's like a pretty niche area. The citywide does not have zoning. But if you look at the populations of these communities that have done complete overhauls, they're not so different from the population of Austin. So it makes you think, well, maybe it's possible. You see Phoenix with 1.6 million people. Philly also did a comprehensive rezoning in 2012. But again, it's not such a huge number of cities that we have a lot of great models to choose from. I'll just point out that Hartford, Connecticut is on that list. We rezoned in 2016, and I'll probably say a little bit more about that in a minute. The average population of those cities that did rezone in that period was 468,000 compared to Austin's 960, maybe I think it's more like 960. That may be a typo. The average size is 145 square miles. Austin is bigger than that, but you did see a couple of smaller cities, or mostly smaller cities than Austin. The size of the city could also a larger city might also mean a more complicated zoning code. I'll just say that Boston, which I believe is 42 square miles, defies that trend. In 42 square miles, they had 3,800 pages of zoning codes and hundreds of zoning districts. Again, just a few words on the Hartford overhaul, and I have a ton of images and pictures that I sometimes show, but I think for this crowd, I might keep it a little simple and just say that there are a few provisions that we put in the city of Hartford's code. Unlike the city of Austin, Hartford is a post-industrial city that is, to some extent, built out. It has historic buildings that are said to be the largest number of historic buildings per capita of any city in the country, buildings that are on the National Register of Historic Places, factories all over the city, including gold leaf factories, one that was recently redone to be a community asset, food hub, public library, and other amenities. Another one, the Colt factory, Colt manufacturing, a less desirable product, but the factories themselves have been rehabilitated for housing and office and a brewery and some other uses. So you see, large manufacturing facilities all over Hartford, but you also see a large number of residential developments, both single family with accessory housing, 2-family, 3 triple deckers that you see in New England, and then what we have in Hartford called the Perfect Six. So thinking about the city, again, very different from Austin from an economic perspective too. The city is one of the poorest cities in the country. It's not growing very much. It's 85% Black and Latino. And as a central city bounded on all sides by other cities and towns, Connecticut is entirely incorporated. Austin cannot grow. Hartford cannot grow. So cities in Texas can grow through annexation. And are seemingly already pretty big, but at 17 square miles, Hartford can't. 17, 18 square miles, Hartford really can't grow. So it was in that context that we looked at the zoning code and saw that it was far too restrictive to build multifamily housing. So we made all housing where we allowed it as of right. Of course, some areas were non-residential developments. Some areas still had single-family plus accessory dwelling provisions, but everywhere that we had housing, including downtown, where everything was a full-on special permit public hearing, we made it as of right. We eliminated minimum parking requirements. I know you've done that here in Austin. That's mandatory. It's just if developers want parking, they will build it. We've seen that time and time and again. And we've also seen that parking adds significant costs to housing development in particular, because that is not just a paper cost. It's something that's passed on to renters or to ultimate occupants, renters or buyers. So that was an important move that we made. We also created a form-based code citywide. One of the things, especially for a low-growth place, that developers need in order to invest is certainty about what will be approved. A form-based code that was compatible with the existing historic fabric was an excellent choice for Hartford. I guess I have to say, if I do say so myself, since we adopted that code, but it was a good choice for Hartford. We unanimously adopted our overhaul in one night, by the way, without objection. We had a really robust public engagement process that was led by the commissioners themselves. But anyway, we adopted the form-based code because we thought it would help people be certain. And that was really important, too, to pair with as-of-right housing provisions, because you want to fast-track it, but you also want to give guidelines as to how that development will occur. I love what we did on urban farming. It was illegal citywide. We legalized all kinds of urban farming for a city that has large parts of it considered to be a food desert without access to fresh foods and groceries. It was important, and we do see people taking advantage of that, including community groups that have community gardens and urban farms and so on. And then finally, we have a number of sustainability provisions. I included a few in here. Again, New England City, although not unlike Austin in its treelessness in many neighborhoods, we put in robust provisions on tree planting and maintenance. So for every new development, a certain number of trees have to be planted. Required, if somebody did put in parking, that they have electric vehicle charging stations, 3% for the large lots of spaces. And then finally, fast-tracked renewable permissions, really clarifying exactly where they would be allowed and where they would not be allowed, and that includes building-mounted wind, building-mounted solar, and freestanding solar. So, as I said, I did do a report for Boston, and going back to those two approaches, it's either a complete overhaul or a piecemeal approach. My recommendation was a complete overhaul, and this was actually, I had written the report last January, and then it sort of was reviewed and then finally got released in the fall, and I forgot I wrote this. I said, that's right, all trees, no forest. But that was what the code was. It's all trees and no forest. I really was pushing in my report that, well, you have two approaches, Boston. I think they're going to do a piecemeal approach. I hope that they continue to be ambitious with that approach. But it might be instructive for Austin what exactly they're doing. I do believe that the two cities have similarities in that fast-growing cities, increasingly expensive cities with, in their case, established transit, in this case, new transit, and then also just demographically, who's moving in, who's getting pushed out. I think that there are more similarities between Boston and Austin than just the rhyme. I watch this from afar so sadly because, again, I know many in this room and elsewhere really tried to push for a comprehensive approach, a comprehensive overhaul, and it was sad to do that, to see that happen. But just to say that Austin is not alone in trying that. It's really hard to do an overhaul. It's really hard to rip off the Band-Aid. On the other hand, one of the cases that I've tried to make to cities that have asked for my opinion is you're going to have the same amount of process if you do piecemeal stuff. So you're either just going to have to fortify yourself for getting yelled at or rotten tomatoes or whatever, once, or you once, maybe a little bit longer, and get that pushed through, or you can just try to get yelled at all at once. We never got yelled at in Hartford. But we are where we are. So I think what I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. So what about the piecemeal approach? So what are the kinds of things that you guys have been looking at, and what are the kinds of things that I would maybe encourage additional thinking about? As I understand it, you have had some really recent changes, fresh off the city council, what is it called, agenda, I guess. So your 3 dwelling unit allowances, I think that was paired with minimum lot size reforms and elimination of public hearings for three-family housing. I think you've also done some things on tiny homes, which in some places, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but minimum unit sizes are mandates in some places, so it sounds like they're not necessarily, it's not necessarily so in the places you've allowed tiny homes. So that's pretty exciting, and I think those kinds of changes will go a long way. They will be helpful, and so pat yourselves on the back for that. I do. Oh, should I take questions now, or should I?
Is that a question?
It's about the no public hearing. We did have public hearings, so I don't know.
Oh, what I meant was no public hearings for new 3 dwelling units. Not to say that you did not use public hearings during the process for adopting these. Thank you for allowing me to clarify that. Just to say, too, though, there's a cautionary tale that not every city has been sort of attuned to. And you see that in Minneapolis, which is a place where there was a lot of talk about eliminating single-family zoning, and they, too, allowed for what people call missing middle housing in single-family zones, but they didn't necessarily eliminate all of the other things that need to be required, that shape housing development. So I don't normally just sort of post links to my papers, but I've written so squarely in these areas that I figure at least it's a starting point, and I'm about to show you a couple of charts from this paper. It's called Zoning by 1,000 Cuts. And so that's my basic premise in this paper, is that there's more to zoning than just the number of units that you require. So this tagline, and in fact we've seen it even this morning at Yimbitown, in advocacy community, there's this rallying cry, eliminate single family zoning, but that is not all that you need to do. There are all of these other little rules in zoning that unfortunately make a difference. So I'll talk about a few of those: lot requirements, building requirements, occupancy requirements. And again, many in this room have worked in high levels of detail on this, but for others and for people in the virtual world out there, just as a quick high-level overview of some of the lot requirements that you see in zoning, minimum lot size is one of them. So how much land do you need in order to do something on it? There could be minimum lot sizes for residential developments, for single-family, multifamily, minimum lot sizes for certain kinds of industrial, commercial uses, minimum lot size regardless of the use. But again, it's the amount of land that you need per use. Larger minimum lot sizes, especially in residential subdivisions, have extreme environmental consequences because they require you, the bigger a lot size, the more likely it is you have to drive. Then we create this car culture that we could have potentially avoided if we had voted for light rail in 20-something years ago, maybe in Austin, but is the virtual status quo virtually everywhere because we do see across the country large minimum lot sizes, and that's something that I know from the National Zoning Atlas. Minimum parking requirements, so how many parking spaces do you need per use? And again, you've tackled that here, so I'm not going to go too far into it. Maximum lot coverage, the maximum percentage that you can build on a lot. Now, this one's interesting. We have some communities that will say you can only build on 10% of your lot, with the potentially laudable goal in mind of allowing for more permeable surface, so more grass or more trees. But often you see that those areas which have low lot coverage percentages have high minimum lot sizes. So any potential environmental benefit that you might have from limiting the amount of lot you can build on is far outdone in a negative way by the minimum lot size that requires you to build sprawl and kill farmland and forests. In fact, in Connecticut, we saw over a 15-year period that residential sprawl reduced farmland and forest land by 6 and 15%, either respectively or reverse. I didn't make a mental note of that, but those are the figures, 6% and 15% for forest and farmland. Florida area ratio, we do see this in some places. We are logging that in the National Zoning Atlas, but it's not as big of a factor as you might think it is, given the weight that it's given in planning school, let's say. Building requirements, maximum building height. I understand here you have what's called compatibility standards, or referred to offhand as that, within 450 feet of certain kinds of residential development, single-family development. You have to mind your height. In Connecticut, that takes a different form. It takes the form of height of the building itself. And we logged those in the Connecticut Zoning Atlas. And this, I just kind of, you might not be able to see it fully, but you can see that the building height in primarily residential districts, so that's that top row, or the third row, but the top row with the category. Across the board, it's in the high 80%, high and mid 90% of land that requires a maximum building height. What that means is that either they're limited in number of stories or they're limited in number of feet. So they could say 2 stories or they could say 25 feet, but one way or the other, 94% of single-family land has a height cap. You'll also see if you go to the right where it says 4 or more family, again, 85% of land with 4 or more family housing has a height cap. I think one reason for that is that the places which allow, one reason why it's less is that the places that allow 4 or more family housing as of right already have other limitations, or including maximum number of units, or are places like downtowns where they don't necessarily care how tall you build and won't expect for you, given economic conditions, to build a 50-story building anyway. Here is a chart that shows, again, just Connecticut as we've done summary statistics for the whole state, so this is just an example, certainly a different kind of state and different kind of development than Austin. But there, the height caps in number of story and number of story equivalents are about 3, just over 3. So just to give you a sense of those height caps. In addition, there are unit size requirements all over the country. So minimum unit sizes require a single apartment, usually, to be a certain size, but they also require sometimes single-family homes to be a certain size. In about a quarter of the districts in Connecticut, a fifth, actually, 22%, there is a minimum unit size for apartments. In the districts where there's a minimum unit size for single-family housing, it's over 1,000 square feet in 40% of the land. So what that means is that you can't build tiny homes in that area because there's a minimum unit size. Not to mention, or you're putting aside the fact that the Connecticut Supreme Court said that minimum unit sizes were illegal. Cities still have them on the books. In addition, there's maximum unit sizes for accessory dwelling units. The majority of Connecticut communities that have accessory dwelling units have maximum unit sizes. I don't know. I didn't check. Maybe you can. Somebody can tell me whether Austin has a maximum unit size for accessory dwellings. It's fairly common, and probably unfortunately so. Connections to water and sewer lines, sometimes that's a requirement. I don't think you have that issue here in Austin. Connections to transit is another building requirement. I also wanted to comment on occupancy requirements. So especially for ADUs, accessory dwelling units, so units that are considered secondary to a primary dwelling, or units that might be considered to be part of an industrial complex. So, for example, night watchman housing is a thing. And so we see ADUs across the country, both for single-family dwellings and in non-residential areas where the person is an employee of the institution. And so just to give you a sense of in Connecticut, 70% of accessory dwelling unit allowing jurisdictions require the owner to be a resident of either the main unit or the accessory unit. A quarter say it has to be a family member or an employee. In 14% of places, there's a prohibition on non-renters. I didn't jot down the elderly requirement. That's out there. I would say it's less than 10%, though. I did want to say a word, too, about public hearings, just to come back to that comment that I made earlier about what we did in Hartford. If you are familiar at all with single-family zoning and permitting for single-family zoning, it is by and large permitted without a public hearing. So anybody who's building a single-family lot, a development, or building a single-family home on a lot can roll into the city planning office with decent plans and probably get a permit pretty quickly without requiring extensive input by your neighbors. You can see here, again, just using a Connecticut example, 46% of land that allows for two-family housing triggers a public hearing. Then it jumps rapidly up to somewhere in the 90s for three or more family housing. And that is true for that kind of housing in primarily residential areas, that is, areas which don't have mixed uses or office or retail along with the residential. But even jumping down to mixed with residential, you still see pretty high numbers for 2, 3, and 4 family housing. This is significant because anytime you require a public hearing, it adds time to the process. That costs the project proponent money, and it also introduces uncertainty. Who was in the room that night when they voted, and what did they have for dinner the night before? Or did they not have dinner and they were hangry, and so they voted against the project because people were taking too long? A lot of public hearings ride on human nature and who is showing up to opine one way or the other. Anika Singh Lamar, who's a Yale Law professor, a clinical professor, did a really interesting paper on participation in zoning. And she and I both agree that the participation should come when you're writing the rules, not when it's a specific project is on the line, because I think you get worse results that way. But nonetheless, that's how we zone in this country, and it's not just in Connecticut. I know, too, that you guys are looking at transit-oriented development and how you're going to capitalize on the new development. I was fortunate this morning, or just after late morning, to be sitting around a table with some experts from Brookings, Sightline Institute, and other nonprofit organizations saying, I'm going to go talk to the city of Austin today. What should I tell them about transit-oriented development? And they helped me crowdsource this in a way to say that the main thing about how to write equitable TOD is to not make it complicated. Don't require ground floor retail. And I think that has been a failed experiment in many places. Don't require complicated formulas for affordable housing. Do include, where it is appropriate, mandates for affordable housing. But others around the country have seen that overcomplicating transit-oriented development actually means that it does not get built. Eliminating public hearings, eliminating minimum lot sizes, eliminating minimum parking requirements. I didn't throw the public hearing one up there, but add it to the list. All of those things to smooth the process, to make development easy, will result in development. That said, the city should have a lot to say about what kind of development that actually is. So whether it's through design guidelines, form-based codes, just cutting and pasting from another community. Stealing code is not a crime. It's a law. It's not copyrighted. Take it if you think it's good. I wanted to point out a few things because Connecticut is one of the places that we've used the zoning atlas to look at transit-oriented development. So I founded in 2000 an organization in light of all of the conversations we were having about race and structural racism, a group called Desegregate Connecticut. And that's really where the zoning atlas came from. It's where my views on housing have been shaped by the 80 members of our coalition. But one of the things that we tried to do right away was to analyze where train stations and in the green there, Connecticut fast track stations were. So that's a bus rapid transit. So you can see, actually, I'm going to flip to this side, just to say 51 train stations, 10 fast track stations. There's a number of communities in Connecticut, and there's where they are in purple, that have rail or fast track. But when we looked at zoning, slightly different purple that you're going to see here, because this is from the old Connecticut Zoning Atlas. But this shows you where housing of any kind is allowed in Connecticut. Most of Connecticut is purple. 91% of the land in Connecticut allows for single-family housing. The image on the right shows you where multifamily housing is allowed in Connecticut. There's no purple. It's 2% of the land allows for multifamily housing as of right. What we found in looking at these train stations, and I'll skip ahead here, is that very few towns actually allowed for as of right multifamily housing, which means that there's a huge amount of state and federal investment that has gone into these stations with very little economic growth or economic payoff to show for it. And again, look at the large number. I mean, Connecticut is the same population as Houston, where I'm from, and it has all these little train stations, and they're frankly underutilized because the only people who use them are people who drive there to maybe get into New York or maybe take a trip. And they're underutilized. They're increasingly well utilized, but they're still far underutilized for what they need to be. We also saw what we called transit towns. 22 of 40 required large minimum lot sizes. That's a half acre or more. I mean, really, a large acre minimum lot size is like an eighth of an acre or more when you're talking about a train station or any lot size minimum at all. So yet here we see, and certainly many of the communities had 1 or 2 acre minimum lot sizes around their train stations. And by the way, you guys, the state of Connecticut as a whole, 80% of residential land has a 1 acre minimum. 50% of land has a 2 acre minimum. So believe me when I say I understand that there are lots of differences between Austin and Connecticut, but I just want this to be some food for thought for you as you think about how the city zones here. So additionally, we wrote a report about this. It's on the Desegregate Connecticut website, which is desegregate.org/data. You can get a report on this and a report on environmental costs of sprawl, and as well as a little report on economic growth. But if you want to dig into detail, but the wealthiest, the least racially diverse, the smaller towns were the ones that allowed less multifamily housing or that required more large minimum lot size housing. So with that, and giving so much into some other states, I just wanted to show a few slides about the National Zoning Atlas, and then maybe turn to some Q&A. So actually, let me just pause here to say, if you want to follow along and explore the atlas yourself, it's free to the public. It's there to be used. It's there to be screenshotted. So go to zoningatlas.org/atlas. It doesn't necessarily work as well on mobile. We are working on that, I promise. But it is a cool tool. So we've talked about what zoning is. I wanted to also just mention what makes zoning complicated and what makes the project, the National Zoning Atlas, complicated. So Austin has its 400-page zoning code. Lakeway has its own zoning code. Buda, Bee Cave, all these towns all around the city have their own zoning codes, which means understanding at scale, like we saw in the Connecticut Atlas, from one jurisdiction to another in common form, how each jurisdiction zones is difficult because it's totally decentralized. Each zoning code is written differently. They're structured differently. They use different words. They use different words to say the same thing. They use the same words to describe two totally different things. That if I could count on, well, I'd run out of hands, but the number of commercial mixed-use districts, they could mean anything. It could mean residence and office. It could mean office and commercial. It could mean industrial and light industrial. It could mean warehouse and office. I mean, so just the same type of zoning district name can be many different things in different towns. And then if you're not a planner or a lawyer or somebody who's just a zoning nerd, you can find these codes to be pretty convoluted and jargon heavy. Every state, by the way, has zoning. Every state enables local governments to enact zoning through the State Zoning Enabling Act, which started off in the 1920s, is pretty similar. They've all been modified, the state's zoning enabling acts over the years, some more dramatically than others. And again, that has I did want to give a shout out to our amazing team for the National Zoning Atlas. These guys are all housed at Cornell University. We're about to announce 7 new people who will be hired by a new affiliated nonprofit. Our interns, who are awesome too. One is from UT Austin, Michael Lopez. He's there, fifth from the left at the bottom. He's at Yimby Town today. Otherwise, he would be here as well. So just a shout out to the staff that's building it. And to say that as of today, we have about 40 million people covered by zoning atlas towns. Now it's really interesting. So this is a map in purple of the places that have been covered to date. So of course Connecticut's covered. Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Hawaii are have full state coverage. Today at the conference, I announced that we would be covering Colorado, Arizona, Alaska, Utah, Georgia, and North Carolina in full. We have some teams going in Texas. I'll show you an image of that in a moment. We have a Dallas-Fort Worth team that's based out of UNT that will be finishing that up. I was hoping to have Austin today or San Antonio, but we didn't quite make it in time. We have been working on the Gulf Coast, and we have a few jurisdictions around Austin. In total, again, this is just to zoom out in case there are questions about this, we have about 8,000 jurisdictions in progress across around 30 states, a couple thousand jurisdictions completed, 4 state, and then a bunch of regional atlases completed. And then we have those 13 full-time staff, but we also have about 320 contributors to the project to date from 85 collaborating institutions. So this has gotten some really good press. We're very proud of the momentum that has been built, but 40 million is not the whole country, and so we are working as fast as we can to get it done. So just a quick word to say, Austin is coming soon. I'm committed to that, and I promise you it will be up soon. But in the meantime, I encourage you to zoom in, and to do that, you go to the bottom left of your screen if you're online. Go to Zoom to Texas, and then you can either zoom to Travis County under the county. Actually, you don't want to zoom to Travis County. You want to just kind of zoom into the general area from Texas if you want to see even more. Those areas in gray in this slide do not have zoning. So we have looked at them. They don't have zoning, mostly the unincorporated areas within counties. The other white places are in progress jurisdictions. I did have a friend in college whose parents lived in Lakeway, so I was delighted to see Lakeway done, and again, some of these other surrounding jurisdictions, which have exactly the kind of zoning characteristics that you would expect, mostly primarily residential. Not a lot of industrial uses. You might not see too much industrial in Austin. I will point out, though, that if you are in the zoning atlas and you go to show me where, and you click on single-family homes, that one toggle, you'll get the image on the right, which is essentially the exact same image as I showed you before, confirming that virtually all of these communities that we've done so far primarily do allow single-family housing. Then if you toggle, release single-family homes and then toggle 4 or more family housing, you see here virtually none of the surrounding communities in Austin allow for multifamily housing as of right. Now, the reason that this is relevant to the city and the city's context is because it shows you potentially that you are the city that's providing the multifamily housing. You have an imperative, a greater obligation to enable that kind of housing because your neighbors are not doing it, and of course you can't force them to do it yourself as a city. So I just encourage you to, as we get all of the jurisdictions in Travis, Williamson, and surrounding counties online, that you explore this. It is interesting, though, to note that how many jurisdictions do not have zoning. So I think that's something else to keep an eye on. I don't know how that story plays out in the future, but it's something, again, to kind of keep your eye on. I'll also encourage you in the atlas to check out Nashville. So again, these are not entirely similar cities. No two cities of these sizes are alike. Nashville is much larger. in land size, 526 square miles versus 305 square miles, is smaller in population, which means it's more spread out. Again, you can see the stats here, 700,000 versus almost 1 million. But from an economy and culture perspective, from a who's moving in, who's moving out, who's being displaced, again, similar to Boston. So if you don't think Boston's a good comparator city, check out Nashville. And Boston will be up at some point, but Boston is so complicated. It's so complicated. It's taking us much longer than we hoped. But Nashville is up, and it might be another place for you to check out. Here's an image of Nashville on the atlas. We also have, thanks to our partners at the Beacon Center in Tennessee, they did Nashville and they did the surrounding neighborhoods. Again, they're one of the 85 collaborating institutions. Again, you see in Nashville probably I don't know what we'll see in Austin, actually. I don't want to venture to guess, but it's a big difference, single family on the left versus multifamily as of right, without public hearings on the right. So concentrated in, maybe downtown, of course, the commercial spines, and you can follow. The zoning atlas allows you to follow the trail of where these things go, and here it's pretty visual. It's visual. You can really see, where the multifamily housing is allowed. It's on those central corridors and along the highways. So I think I could literally talk about zoning for 8 hours a day, but I think we're right at 2 o'clock, so I think I'll stop there and we can just maybe exchange dialogue, and I'd love to actually learn from you all what you're thinking about and learn from you. Thanks.
Thank you. Absolutely. So we're a little bit, I guess our budgets only afford 2 microphones, so we'll be playing this back and forth a little bit. But yeah, we'll open up to questions. But real quick, I wanted to ask, because you mentioned form-based zoning, and I know that probably everybody here knows what that is. But if there's anybody else out there, anybody who's watching or recording later, there's a couple of approaches to zoning. It's form-based, Euclidean, there might be others, I don't know. Could you just kind of maybe briefly explain them, briefly? And are any or either of them more or less predisposed to equitable or sustainable communities?
Okay, so that's a great question. So maybe I'll explain them, and then I'll answer the second question. If I forget it, remind me. So in the 1920s, the Supreme Court considered a case called Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty about an Ohio city that, by the way, has been posted in the National Zoning Atlas, so you can see exactly how it zones today. It was one of our top Ohio priorities, of all places. But the city of Euclid, the village of Euclid, rather, had a zoning code, and it was an early zoning code, so again, 1920s, and it was sued by a commercial developer for being a commercial property owner for being unconstitutional. The Supreme Court said, no, this is constitutional. You can regulate on the basis of use. And by the way, the Supreme Court threw in a phrase that said that apartment buildings were, quote, mere parasites on the single-family zone. So you can tell how the Supreme Court felt about apartments, and a sentiment that sometimes you experience today. The code in the city of Euclid was actually pyramidal, which meant that so in an industrial zone, or what would be considered an industrial zone, any use that was allowed in the city was allowed. And then it got smaller and smaller and smaller until the top of the pyramid was the single-family zone, and only the single-family zone was allowed. But let's say if you start with single-family, the next one you could have single-family, two-family, the next one you could have single-family. So when I think of Euclidean zoning, I think of that pyramidal zoning, but pyramidal zoning is not in use today. So people refer to Euclidean zoning as maybe you would call it traditional zoning that regulates on the basis of use. Form-based zoning is really maybe a concept that has always been around because we've always had limitations on height. We've always had limitations on bulk and on density. So in some ways you could say even early zoning codes had those kinds of form parameters. But the phrase became more popular with the rise of the new urbanists in the 1990s and their first more form-based code, although it still regulated uses in Seaside, Florida. And so again, for those who are students of planning history, you know all about this. But the cities that have adopted form-based coding, and there's several hundred of them today that have city-wide form-based codes, they try to articulate guidelines for development. Sometimes they do it citywide. Sometimes they just do it for certain zones, including like a downtown or something. Connecticut has a couple of citywide form-based codes, Bridgeport and Hartford, and then other places like Simsbury and Avon have just neighborhood codes, Canton. So you can do it a lot of different ways. If the form-based code requires gold leaf on the exterior of your buildings, then it will be more expensive. So it's hard to say whether one is necessarily more equitable than the other. If, however, you do have a reasonable form-based code that sets out, within some guidelines, the kinds of shapes, sizes, roof types, and whatever you might want to see, that could actually be more equitable because it enables for property owners is kind of besides the point. It's growing. So another way to look at it is whether the form-based code can enable appropriate adaptation to that growth. So I can't answer the second question definitively, but again, I guess the Gold Leaf factory in Hartford is closed, so we don't have a good source for that regardless. So don't put that in your code, Austin.
Fantastic, thank you. Do we have any other questions in the audience here? Evelyn's making her way to you.
So we talked about equitable transit-oriented development, and I noticed you used inclusionary zoning as a tool to encourage some of that. Have you seen any success cases in states like Texas or Tennessee where inclusionary zoning is outlawed?
Oh, you mean at the state level, like an inclusionary mandate? I don't know about if there are state statutes that that prevent it. They're different. I would recommend. I think Claudia Aiken did a report on inclusionary zoning, and it's the principles for success around the country, and she was looking at local level codes. In general, inclusionary zoning can work well in those places where there is a lot of demand and there is potential for displacement of existing communities, and where there is actual demand for construction. So I'll use as an example of a city that has been trying an inclusionary zoning ordinance but not doing a good job at it is Pittsburgh, where my sister just moved from Austin. So I happen to, any place my family members live, I just read the zoning code. So Pittsburgh, that's almost a joke, but it's actually true. Anyway, so Pittsburgh recently adopted an inclusionary zoning ordinance. And in some places in Pittsburgh, that might be a good way to keep to ensure that a wide variety of people can live in a high demand place. But unfortunately, it's a citywide ordinance, I believe now, and there's not a lot of demand for new residential development in Pittsburgh. So what developers have done in response is they've stopped building, at least to the scale that would trigger the inclusionary zoning ordinance. So then it's like, well, which is better, housing at all or the inclusionary mandated housing? So I put it up there as an option, something to consider. For sure, in a place like Austin, where there's constant demand for development, it seems like a place that's more amenable to that. But you may not even want to do it as a blanket rule here in every place. So I think I would encourage you to check out the details of that, what makes a good inclusionary zoning ordinance, and figure out and maybe work backwards from what other cities have done.
Thanks. Well, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we can't use inclusionary zoning in Austin due to the state legislature's decision.
That has been my understanding as well, and that's why we use. Yeah.
This is why I'm learning.
That's That's why I asked if there's any other success stories about encouraging density and affordability through other means. I know we have incentive structures.
We do the bonuses.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing you could do is to deal with it through unit size. So, for example, instead of saying that a certain percentage of units has to be restricted to certain people with certain income, you could say a certain percentage of units has to be efficiencies. A certain percentage of units has to be, shared amenities in some way. So that's another way to do it. Maybe some of those units would be snapped up by people with higher or middle incomes anyway, but it might provide that entry point on the basis of unit size. But in the reverse direction than the way unit size has been used in the past, which is to exclude with a minimum. Here you would say, no, you have to build below a maximum for a certain percentage of units. I may try to tackle it that way.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Right there.
Unless it's needed for online, I won't use the...
It is.
Well, I'll speak at a lower volume then. For the places that have undergone successfully a complete overhaul, are there any tools or data points that have been particularly helpful or relied upon to push those overhauls forward? I'm thinking, are there maps, comparison tools, particular attributes within data sets that people have consistently relied upon?
I think a lot of it depends on what people are used to getting, so and how. So I would use, maybe I'll compare a city of Austin population with a city of Hartford population. So in Hartford, we didn't have, many people have issued reports and data about Hartford and its neighborhoods. The Connecticut Data Collaborative is a great organization that does profiles on neighborhoods, on health equity, and those kinds of things. We didn't have to show the people of the city of Hartford that their communities were not being served in the right way. We didn't have to tell them that all you have is fast food and car washes, and that do you think that's good or not? People, I think, had a really good intuitive sense as to, which neighborhoods they felt had been left behind. And frankly, a lot of it was the result of zoning. So in the 50s and 60s, in tandem with, quote unquote, white flight from Hartford, the zoning codes were changed to make this a city which was once extremely diverse, interesting, and it still is very interesting. It still is diverse, but back then, the idea for city leaders was, oh my gosh, these people are leaving. Let's zone it so that they can get back and forth from the suburbs that they're going to easily. So Hartford's zoning completely flipped on its head, became an extremely car-oriented city, despite its compactness, despite its walkability. Minimum parking requirements ultimately resulted in tear-downs of structures everywhere. So the effects of these bad policies in the past were pretty clear. It was our job on the commission to help people understand why zoning was the problem, and to say, well, what would you like in your neighborhood? Thinking that we probably had some idea, and confirming it and going back and forth with communities and building a level of trust. Virtually all of our commission members did public hearings and public meetings. I did probably 75 with different groups. Myself as the chair of the commission, and it was really just having a meeting, saying, okay, what would you like to change, tying that to specific zoning provisions, putting it in the draft code, showing them where it was in the code, and saying, what do you think about this? I think this is going to help solve this problem. And they would say yes or no, and we would go back and forth. That, with a city of 125,000, I would consider that to be almost retail. It's not politicking, but almost sort of retail, with neighborhood leaders, with business organizations, with Main Street type organizations, with local religious institutions, city council members, just the whole 9 yards. We did a lot of that. I would think in a city like Austin, where you have a much more maybe zoning, you've had so many zoning conversations publicly, you've provided people with all kinds of data. I mean, is it the data that they need? Do they need more data? Or do they just need somebody who's going to be a passionate champion and a trustworthy figure that's going to carry a zoning proposal through? So I think it depends on the city. People in Austin, I don't know if they've been inundated with data and they don't care about data. I don't know, what drives people here. I do think you need political champions, and from what he was talking about today, it seems like Mayor Watson is very interested in land use issues, and hopefully will help to champion whatever is the best planning practices, which I hope that he will. I'm sure. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. My question is sort of around Austin has become increasingly renter city, right? And so we have just a growing share of the population that lives in rental units. And part of the inequity that we are seeing is also just this, sort of stagnant home ownership gap between populations of color and white populations. And so how do we balance sort of being the provider of multifamily units, multifamily housing, and those sort of inequities that we still see around home ownership?
And I guess I should have said this at the beginning, which is that, zoning is only one part of it. So there's so many organizations working nationally, and I think hopefully here in Texas, to try to address the barriers to home ownership beyond just whether there's enough housing to go around. Zoning can dictate whether there's enough housing to go around. Financing can dictate whether that housing gets built. And then, other policies, including lending policies and so on, can dictate whether people who should get, access to, whether through down payments, through down payment assistance, through, other arrangements, can actually get into the homes that are created. So zoning, my little part is zoning, and so I can't really, answer that in, all of the financing aspects. There are people who are much more expert at that than I am, other than to say, if housing can be built and the market conditions allow it to be built, then there's more housing to go around and more people can access it. So I really do believe, and the research shows that supply of any kind can help a housing market with a lot of demand on it to enable people to get housing. I mean, as for the split between renters and homeowners, I think zoning doesn't dictate whether it's a rental or a buyer situation, or at least shouldn't. But I think there is a lot of question right now about whether home ownership is in and of itself the number one goal, because for some people that has resulted in actually negatives to have home ownership. I mean, on the other hand, that's the American dream. So I think for me anyway, there's more to know and more to learn about that. I'm definitely not an expert in that pipeline.
Anyone else? Thank you. I'll just go to our first question online. So I'll go ahead and read this. There's a pattern of the urban heat island effect that shows residential suburban areas have higher surface temperatures in comparison to their surrounding areas, even industrial uses. And despite some vegetation, temperature goes higher by more street width and physical structure when it is not organized and Euclidean, which we all know what that word means now. Would you suggest the change of vegetation from grass to trees could help with decreasing temperature?
Yeah, so lots of studies have shown that trees, mature trees, which need to be planted now, best time to plant a tree, right? Produce significant energy efficiency benefits, cool buildings, and even reduce crime. So I'm a big believer in trees, in tree canopy, and I think you're right that there are some cities, especially central cities and many neighborhoods, where you can just see it on Google Earth plain as day that they don't have trees, they don't have shade, and thus they lose out on some of those pleasant effects of trees. I think they're the most cost-effective infrastructure investment a city can make. I think that street design has to be rethought to accommodate trees. One thing I didn't mention today was that in the City of Hartford zoning code, we have an entire chapter 9, about street design. And the reason that's different than most zoning codes is that most zoning codes stop at the individual property line. They don't really think about what's in the street beyond and how that works for a cohesive whole. But unless you have a street pattern and street amenities, including street trees, that complement the surrounding individual lots, you're really missing out on an opportunity to shape a neighborhood. So I argue in a book that is coming out in October, it's called Key to the City, and I just got on my way here some page proofs for it, so I'm so excited that it's coming out. But there's a whole chapter in that book on streets and why there's a legal argument, a legal justification for cities who have zoning authority, which is every city, except for Houston, which doesn't choose to exercise it, at least on a citywide basis, that there's a legal justification for them to encompass streets into their zoning purview. Cities own streets. A lot of times in the past, cities have exempted their own properties from zoning, but they can also unexempt their own properties from zoning and subject them to zoning. And so coordinate with the Department of Public Works, which right now designs our streets in accordance with a street manual that's made by a coalition of traffic engineers, not by people who want beautiful streets. Maybe they want beautiful streets, but if you threw out that code and gave it to people who wanted beautiful streets, you'd see a lot different streets today. So the Green Book that's used to dictate how our streets are designed is not something that really relates to good urbanism. So I encourage cities to harness and change that using the NACTO guide, which I know Austin uses, but also to incorporate that into zoning so that anything that a private property owner does or can do to complement a chosen design for a whole street, they will do. And so I kind of encourage that. So anyway, trees, yes, big, important question and issue, and should be either as a percentage of canopy or as a number of trees in smaller residential areas be dictated by the city's zoning code.
Thanks so much. Yes, we do happen to love our trees in Austin. I can confirm this is also from online, and it raises a good point. There, generally, when we talk about affordable units, it's sort of a default assumption that it's apartments or multifamily development. So I guess the question is why can't single-family dwelling? Why is it single-family dwellings are in the forefront of our brains when we talk about affordable housing?
Oh, whose brains is it in the forefront of? Maybe that was the. I mean, I think when people think about affordable housing, maybe I'm flipping your question. I think when they hear the phrase affordable housing, they're thinking of multifamily housing. One thing though that is become increasingly of interest to advocates, and maybe this is where the question is going, is single-family housing on small lots, or single-family housing on no minimum lot size, or single-family housing that's more like a townhouse type development, or even tiny homes. So maybe if what I understood the question to be is what maybe the premise is that we as Americans love our American dream, going back to whatever notion we think that was, but your own house and your own lot and your little plot of land, even if it's very small. So affordability can come in different forms, and I do think though, and maybe that's me thinking in terms of opposition to the word affordable housing. When people think of affordable housing, they think it's going to be some wildly destructive, parasitic, to use the phrase of the Supreme Court, multifamily building. But obviously that's not the case. And by the way, there's a large number of studies that show that apartment buildings don't have the same, actually are more efficient for city services, don't have this feared crime, and don't have this influx of unwanted children that will be a bane on your school districts and so on. I mean, the studies just prove none of those fears are well founded. Yeah, but maybe that's some insights.
I think you nailed it. I think that's a lot of the times when you have these discussions, people will say that single-family housing is the most expensive form of housing. But I think you get to a point where if you are talking about lot sizes or other implications like that, you can get it back to not so million-dollar mansions. But I think we have one question over here.
Hello. Yeah. So you had mentioned a question back about NACTO and kind of these more national guides for street planning, street design. I've heard talk about states actually trying to do some zoning reform or some sort of zoning reform from the state level. Can you speak a little bit about some states that have explored that, or what that looks like from a state down level?
Yeah, and are you want to talk about zoning. So, yeah, there have been a number of state zoning reform efforts. Connecticut, after we developed this coalition, did adopt accessory dwelling unit reform statewide, did once again ban, even though the Supreme Court had already banned it, minimum unit sizes, mandated training for planning commissioners, and almost, but not quite, passed a transit-oriented development requiring those communities to upzone those communities with transit systems. That was small potatoes compared to some of the things that California has been doing. California legalized with very few restrictions at all accessory dwelling units statewide over the course of maybe 3 or 4 legislative sessions. Finally now we're seeing in California accessory dwellings being among the highest number of new permits pulled in many, especially the large cities. Montana just we saw what was called the Montana Miracle, and I just missed this morning meeting the head of the Frontier Institute, Kendall Cotton, who developed the Montana Zoning Atlas, the second zoning atlas after Connecticut, to be done, not the full state, but most of the big cities in the state, or all of the big cities in the state, I guess. But they did a big rezoning effort in Montana on a statewide basis on minimum lot size, on number of units, and and accessory dwelling units, and some other things. The governor of Montana is going to be at that conference as well to speak about his laudable efforts in that regard. I think though using those 2 states is, and then there's many other. Vermont has done a lot, so California, Vermont. There have been some, there's a new bill in Kentucky, so you do see, I guess my point is just to say that you do see states all over the political spectrum, and leaders from across the political spectrum, and groups involved in the National Zoning Atlas across the political spectrum, all really disinterested in housing affordability, or property rights, or all of the above, and working for change. So there are a few state trackers out there. I think Steve Menendian from UC Berkeley has one, and then the Turner Center also at UC Berkeley has some information about that. YIMBY Action also has some good resources for those interested in some of the recent statewide efforts. And then Desegregate Connecticut / other states, I think it is, has some of the recent. Utah is another state, interestingly, that gave its larger cities a menu of options. So cities had to change their zoning code to do some number of things within the list of maybe 15 or 20 things. That's something that we haven't seen a lot of, but is another model, other than just the top-down mandates at the state level to override local zoning.
I would love to follow up on that. Like you said, there does seem to be support for zoning reform on kind of a bipartisan spectrum. The Biden White House has come up for it. The Heritage Foundation is for it. There's, in California, you have certain leaders like Scott Wiener at their legislature who are trying to do stuff, very progressive people. Here in Texas last legislative session, we had a more Republican-led effort to try to change zoning rules statewide in certain cities. So, given all this broad support on federal and state level-ish, why is it so hard to change on the city level?
I think it's because individuals care what their neighbors think about them. And so the people who are making a lot of decisions at the local level hear from their neighbors directly, people that they know, where it's maybe more abstract, maybe once removed if you're a state legislator representing far more people than you might on a city council or a town planning commission. I also think you you just have to decide that the leader, there has to be a leader at the local level, and they just have to decide that they're going to do it. Not come hell or high water, not if it's some awful idea, but that they're just going to be committed to do it. And that's what something like a planning department needs. It needs an external champion, a political champion. It doesn't have to be an elected official. It could just be, the spouse of the elected official, the popular spouse, or the local, nonprofit charitable foundation leader, or somebody who or the business association leader, somebody who has clout amongst a good constituency and is a trusted person. Again, it doesn't have to be the elected official, but it has to be important enough people in the town to give cover to elected officials who aren't brave enough to start that commitment, on their own. And this is not speaking about Austin. This is just speaking generally. For me, trying to do, for me, I really don't care what people, we were going to get it done in a good way, in a unanimous way, in a collaborative way. But I think people really knew, at least for me, like we were getting this done. And because Connecticut is the only state in the country where where a city can opt out of their elected officials being involved in zoning, and Hartford did do that, our commission was the final vote. So as chair of that commission, I said, we are going to put the very best practices that we knew of at the time in 2016, which I think still are pretty good practices today, 7 years later. We're going to put the very best in here, and we're going to make it work. We're going to make people excited about zoning, and to some maybe tiny extent we did. At least the people who would talk to us about the zoning code and got into it. We did have advisory groups. Again, we met with a lot of people, but I think it's just somebody saying this is happening, and I don't know. I'm just an optimist. I think if you have that person and they do not mind. They do not mind being criticized. They can articulate the vision. They can, help to persuade, but also take it in and have that openness and that trustedness. That's, maybe it's a unicorn, but I think every city has one. You just have to find it, whether Austin or otherwise.
That is startling. Not startling, but it's certainly shocking that Connecticut officials can opt out of that. I think I hear 10 or 11 council members in Austin who are buying plane tickets right now so that they can make their lives easier. Are there any other questions in person here? Negative? Okay, one right there.
So my question is in reference to the National Zoning Atlas. Aside from a City of Austin Planning Department employee, just as a citizen, all of us from different places just around the U.S., is there anything that we can do to help contribute to that effort at all?
I get the same question. I get the same question in a lot of talks. Right now, we don't have a way for an individual who wants to, let's say, input their jurisdiction to input it. We have these sort of teams that have met a certain knowledge or commitment standard where we say, okay, you're going to be on team X, and we're going to train you and go through the process just because of the methodology, which I didn't show here, but it's 150 pages. There's 120 different zoning characteristics collected for each zoning district. So multiply that by 60 whatever, and then you get the sense that, oh gosh, this is like a huge headache. If you're, the City of Austin, again, is hopefully going to be done soon. I'm sure you guys have open data, so we can at least have a starting point for the GIS. But even with that, we clean it. We do a lot of cleaning, even for places with open GIS. I'm sure Austin's will be perfect. But then we go through the zoning code line by line and analyze it. If you are interested in doing more than a town, or if you're interested in being part of a team, just shoot us an email and we'll see what your level of interest is. But just because of the amount of training that it takes to get somebody onboarded, we end up not being able to do that. That said, we are working with the American Planning Association to try to have a planners portal where city planners, and this is mostly for the small towns and medium-sized towns, where they might be able to upload their jurisdictions. They would be considered maybe a trained, trusted person who can read zoning codes. They administer those zoning codes. And once we get that up, and that's just going to depend on funding. Whenever we get funding to do that, we will embark on that process. But we don't have anything for individuals to do one jurisdiction. We want you to commit, for better or for worse. That's what we got right now.
Anybody else in here have any questions? Very good. This is why I come prepared with my own. So I guess, there's a whole lot of stuff that we're covering. But comprehensive rezonings, I didn't read the entire paper, I just read the abstract. Sorry, I don't have access. But in one of your papers, you apparently contend that comprehensive revisions have the most promise in cities where growth is stagnant or where the economy is depressed. Obviously, Austin, growth is not stagnant. Our economy is very happy and very undepressed. So if that's the case, what do we stand to benefit, and why should we do it if we're not a Hartford or other community?
Well, Denver was at the top of that list, having done a comprehensive rezoning earlier in that period, I believe in 2009. So I wouldn't say, maybe I was really talking about how that could lend itself to jumpstart a community, because as is the case in Hartford, many communities around the country in the 1950s and 1960s, again, essentially flipped their zoning codes around so that they became these much more car-dependent codes with parking requirements and so on. So I'll add a nuance to that and just say it's not just for cities that are stagnant. It's for could be useful in any city. And I think for whatever reasons people thought Code Next was a good idea. Maybe some of those reasons are still relevant today. Was it a bureaucratic process? Was it a uncertainty about what might be permitted? Was it too much development in some places, not enough development in other places? What were the reasons for a desire to have comprehensive rezoning then? Maybe they're still relevant today.
I will leave the activists and the politicians to decide that. But that you did mention, though, and that's one of the things that we've certainly seen in Austin before, where even with the current code, a lot of the development pressures are kind of going to areas where land is less expensive, and that's historically black and brown and marginalized communities in parts of town. And there's a lot of fear that if we did do a comprehensive rewrite, that would just exacerbate the problem. So I wonder if there's, are there any, is there any merit to that, and are there any other examples of cities that sort of have figured out how to balance good change, by not creating bad change, or even reversing the bad change from the days before?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question to answer, just because, neighborhood and citywide housing dynamics and growth patterns can be so different. I do think, though, there were a lot of pretty obvious things that we did poorly in the past that we could reverse for the benefit of everyone. And then the question is, how do you moderate the pace of change in communities where you are potentially going to see displacement? And certainly that's been the case in Austin, just because there's so much growth pressure, especially East Side communities that have seen an influx of people who might have lived downtown or might have lived in and around the university, are now living on the East Side and renting out, buying and then renting out housing for the college or graduate students or young professionals or whatever who did not necessarily live there before. So is anybody doing it perfectly? No. Nobody, I don't think, is perfect. Different cities are trying different things, but the reality is as a country, we don't have enough diverse zoning. And enough zoning that enables us to create housing in the places where people want to live there. But I think there's some communities that are doing it really badly. So you're not one of those. Jackson, Wyoming, maybe, or Aspen, I don't know. Places where you see workers serving the communities, especially the smaller towns, resort towns, living 2 and 3 hours away. So they're, to the extent zoning is a small part of those issues. Protected, the amount of protected land and the impossibility of building in some of those places obviously also contributes.
Thank you for naming names. I was going to ask you, which communities should we shame? Do we have any other questions here real quick before we go on? If not, Evelyn, could you bring that mic to me so we don't have to do the shuffle? And then if anybody does think of something, let me know. Thanks so much. much easier on my neck. So, going back to the, what can you do to put more people and equitably in parts of town? We're doing Project Connect, which is the light rail and transit, high capacity transit project. The city is doing is working on the ETOD policy, the equitable transit oriented development policy. We've seen this. This kind of piggybacks on a question that I asked earlier. We've seen this in communities like Chicago. I think kind of spearheaded ETOD, but they were doing it in an effort to kind of drive development in depressed parts of town. Whereas in Austin, we're being very intentional about trying to prevent displacement while creating new housing and work opportunities for lower income people. Have you ever seen anybody do something like that before?
Again, it's hard to say because I don't know exactly where where you're running into the most issues, and I haven't done as deep a dive into the specific neighborhoods and the current zoning, so I'm not going to be well equipped to kind of tell you, okay, well, in these types of communities, you need to rezone from 2-family to 4-family, and so on. I can't. I don't know. I don't have like any magic answers other than the kinds that I've been kind of spouting out.
I thought it was great. It was a decent job. You tried, and you succeeded admirably. I think we're kind of we still have like 20 more minutes. If anybody has any questions, feel free. Come on, don't be shy. You don't know everything about zoning. Okay, we got Ann right here.
So I think I heard you say you're from Houston. And so, we always hear that Houston doesn't really have zoning. You mentioned maybe historic preservation is counting as zoning there, things of that nature. One of the things that happened with the home phase 1 here was a preservation piece was added on during the public process. And so just wanted to hear your thoughts about where preservation fits into the conversation. Also because one of the questions we had in the chat mentioned, commenting on how all of the new even though ADUs are being built smaller housing, stuff like that, they're still very expensive. And my reaction to that is, it's because they're new. But I would like to hear your expertise on where preservation fits in, new versus old, things of that nature.
Yeah, preservation has a significant role to play in the preservation community. Historic properties have always been more affordable. Often been more affordable. If you look at the kinds of developments that have been created by the federal rehabilitation tax credit, over 600,000 units of housing that have been created through the tax credit alone, not to mention state and federal credits that we don't have good figures in the number of housing units that have actually been created. If you look at where naturally occurring affordable housing occurs, it's often in older communities where people have divided up homes or always had an accessory dwelling unit because of the nature of the housing stock and so on. So I do think that in some cases contemporary debates and opportunities, quote unquote, have skewed some conversations toward people thinking that preservationists may not be in favor of affordable housing, or that historic communities are bad places for it. We certainly do see, and again, the literature shows that a historic designation does correspond with high property values, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be dug into in order for us to understand whether that is really that it's a chicken or egg problem. Is a designation a reflection of the fact that the people have the resources to commission a study of their neighborhoods that would designate it historic? Or in the case, and we were just having a roundtable on preservation and housing in California, that some people who are not really preservationists are using preservation because of, again, quote unquote opportunities and statutes that enable people to maybe manipulate the process in ways that would prevent new housing from being built in their communities through a historic designation. I think preservationists are getting to the bottom of all of that and are trying to be proactive in their solutions. But I think that's an ongoing conversation. As for the affordability of accessory dwellings. I mean, they're not as expensive as the main units, presumably, in the same communities. And if that's the case, then at least in a relative sense, they're providing a second unit on the same lot in a maybe just slightly less expensive, but presumably mostly relatively less expensive than relative to the main unit. So I guess how do you answer that, or how do you address that? Just to say, well, if we had more accessory dwellings, that would drive the price of accessory dwellings down, because there would be more for people to choose from who want that kind of housing. So I would continue to push for that supply-oriented response.
Trying to think of an intelligent way to articulate it that would make you sound like a great interviewer, but I'm coming up with nothing. So my question for you is, could you just talk real quickly about the intersection of zoning reform and climate change?
Yeah, so I touched on this a little bit when talking about minimum lot sizes. If you have people living more densely in general, they are using less land. They are using fewer roads, shorter roads. They don't require the same kind of utility infrastructure. It doesn't have to be built out as far. So you do have, from compact development, a climate angle that is certainly, you see in studies of the transportation impact of people who live in New York City versus people who live, I don't know, let's say Houston, and just looking at the footprint of the greenhouse gases they emit. We did do surveys in Connecticut, including in that report on transit-oriented communities that I screenshotted in the presentation. So I would encourage you to look at that. Often, again, it's corresponding to location of the community relative to transit and the use of the car.
So I think we're kind of winding down here, but I want to ask you this, because zoning is obviously the most exciting thing in the world.
Yeah.
For everybody involved.
100%.
But I mean, it truly is. Like I mentioned earlier, the Biden White House is taking taking notice. The Heritage Foundation. It's we have publications like City Labs and so on and so forth, and so there's a lot of attention it's been getting over the years, and it's now in political fights at state houses and city halls everywhere else. And I just wonder, in all your time following and living and breathing and eating zoning, is this not the most exciting time for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great last question, which is, I do think that it's a great time to be involved in zoning conversations. It's a great time to be an advocate for housing, because as much of a crisis as we're in, I think there are more people who are paying attention to it, and there are more people who are outwardly showing maybe what they were keeping inside earlier, which is that they care about having new neighbors, they care about seeing new housing, and they want to do it in an equitable and sustainable way. And so I applaud the city for taking on the chunks of the code, the piecemeal approach that they are pursuing, that you guys are pursuing now. And I'm glad to have been here today. So thank you so much for inviting me. And I look forward to seeing Austin grow in exactly that equitable and sustainable way in the coming years. Fingers crossed.
We'll see. To me, it feels like being a comic book fan growing up in the 90s and always getting picked on, and then now they're the most popular thing in the world, and I feel so validated. We're the cool kids now. Zoning is where it's at.
Exactly.
Well, Sara Bronin, are there any final words? I mean, you just kind of wrapped it up there, but if you have anything else to add or anything else to say,
Thank
now's
you.
your time.
Thank you again for having me.
All right. Well, I don't know if Ann is going to come back up and close us out. I shall do so. I forgot to prepare that part. So thanks, everybody, for showing up or watching online. That was Sara Bronin from Cornell University and just about everywhere else. If anybody wants to follow you or know more about you, is there a website or a Twitter account? Or
Just at Sara Bronin.
Okay, at Sara
Twitter.
Bronin.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, on Twitter.
Or LinkedIn.
Or X.
I'm very
or
chatty.
Whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah, so well, thank you for coming down and showing up and being part of this latest installment of the Imagine Austin Speaker Series. We're talking about zoning, and I'm absolutely not zoned out. I'm totally zoned in right now. I'm going to go and read Hartford's new code and still marvel that they didn't yell at you when you guys were rewriting that. Otherwise, everybody, thanks for showing up, and I suppose we'll keep y'all posted about future Imagine Austin event series on behalf of City of Austin Planning Department and everybody who helped put this on, who I appreciate. I'm Caleb Pritchard with the Planning Department, so have fun out there. Go out and grab some lunch and think about zoning.